Okay, so we've called this talk Trans-Scalar Design Thinking, Unpacking the Systems of Affordable Housing in Mass Timber. And to expand on that a little bit, we're going to talk through some of our work. It's pretty firmly couched in the realms of mass timber and affordable housing, but it's kind of different in that it sort of steps back from those and thinks about mass timber and affordable housing as systems that operate on multiple scales simultaneously, and that as designers, as builders, as manufacturers, we have a broad agency to affect those systems, those scales, if we in fact choose to engage them. As you can see here, we work at the University of Minnesota and at Auburn University. We teach, we research. Our teaching and our research are coupled together. We teach issues surrounding building systems, mass timber, and architecture. We work in the architecture departments of those respective schools. And we have a practice, the Decentralized Design Lab, and that practice does very small projects. You'll see some of them. They stand in contrast to some of the work we've seen. But part of the reason those are small is because they're coupled to our research at the universities, and they're representative of kind of a larger agenda. Decentralized Design Lab is a geographically decentralized practice, and we're kind of dedicated to finding participatory, novel, design-based solutions. We're going to talk about these two projects. They can be kind of loosely defined as housing solutions. The one on the left is for a First Nations group in Manitoba, and the one on the right for the chronically homeless in Minneapolis. And these are building solutions. But we think in either case that the building is really an alibi for us to think about an ulterior agenda, one that hopefully gets to the core issues that are at the kind of root of the issues of homelessness and poverty and low-quality housing. Architects, engineers, developers, manufacturers, we kind of typically operate within certain boundaries, but we think that by explicitly kind of thinking about expanding beyond those boundaries, we can rethink our agency in affecting different realms outside of our own, helping us to find kind of more powerful, lasting solutions for the issues of affordable housing and homelessness. So for example here, this might be a diagram sort of ascribed to an architect. And architects typically think about buildings, but in thinking about buildings, we're really kind of talking about regions, we're talking about climate zones, we're talking about continents, and we're talking about how we might affect the world at large. And this diagram might be attributed to, say, a manufacturer, where they're manufacturing a product, the 2x4, but in doing so, they've affected kind of realms outside of their own, the mill, the logging operations, the forest, and then kind of larger global systems, so like the sun, how the sun affects the growth of a forest. Similarly, an engineer, somebody dealing with human comfort issues, might think about the human body and how the boundary layers of a building and air temperatures and how the kind of scaling down the material properties might affect how they think about their practice. And then we also think about, this might be ambitious to think about large timescales, but I think ambition is something we should strive for. I think there's nothing wrong with being ambitious, thinking about as manufacturers, designers, and architects are thinking can and should impact these larger realms. And I think that in our practice we see the present housing crisis and the emergence of mass timber as truly a kind of sea change in the way that we think about building and the way we think about housing, the way we think about human comfort on the planet. So if we're not ambitious enough to think about these kind of larger timescales, then what are we ambitious about? So we have two quotes here that I'd like to kind of walk through. Design is the action of bringing something new and desired into existence, a proactive stance that resolves or dissolves problematic situations by design. It is a compound of routine, adaptive, and design expertise brought to bear on complex, dynamic situations. As designers, we're always looking for novelness. We're looking for making something new, something that can exist where something didn't beforehand. We're looking for those aha moments where we have an object emerge. But we'll follow it up with another quote, that we need to begin applying design thinking to the invisible universe of processes, policies, and procedures as thoroughly and as rigorously as we've applied it to the visible world. So in this sense, novelness, our job as designers to create something new, is not limited to the visible physical objects, but can be applied to the invisible non-object systems that design can affect. Design is often seen as a process that ends with an object, but we think that an object can be a catalyst for a process, an invisible process. And that's an important distinction for us to make as we think about poverty and we think about homelessness, because poverty and homelessness are the result of invisible systems that we need to engage at their core if we're going to truly begin to affect them. Our work began in graduate school. I'll take you through a bit of kind of chronology here. This project was the Littleton Trials, and it kind of began as an object-based thermal investigation, but it really quickly evolved as we engaged with folks who had an expertise that was far outside of our own, namely in this case the foresters of the New England Forestry Foundation. We understood their goals as different than our own. Their goals involved issues of restoration, forest management, forest productivity. And we began to realize that their goals that existed outside of our own might actually operate in parallel with our own, despite kind of existing at different scales. So in this sense, we kind of evolved the idea of labeling ourselves as non-experts, of actively engaging with people with expertise outside of our own, and relying on them to guide our understanding of different scales of a project. So in this case, more specifically, in this project, we were thinking about building mass timber panels to form this sort of test structure. But we began to think about how that object might catalyze other processes. In this case, for example, this panel is being formed from black locust, a species that has sort of detrimental impacts on the forest health and kind of economic productivity of a forest. We also thought about systems that might sort of incentivize the harvesting and usage of species like red maple that would allow the kind of more valuable productive species like eastern white pine to be grown in their stead. So in this way, we were thinking about how the building as an object might be a catalyst for processes that are in realms outside of our own, in this case, forestry and ecology. Following this project, we went to our kind of separate universities and took these ideas with us. So this is some of my students at Auburn University learning how to fabricate kind of small-scale mass timber panels. They investigated the species involved with them and how those species selections might impact the social issues, economic issues, and ecological issues across the Southeast, and particularly in the state of Alabama. Jacob, you want to talk about your?
This is a project that we did at the University of Minnesota, and it's looking at all different kinds of basically wood construction and trying to figure out how one construction type can improve or enhance the usage of another. So we're using the CLT as a way of bracing a heavy timber frame that's supporting a lightweight balloon screen and putting this on a trailer and moving it around as a mobile learning lab for communities. So it's looking kind of critically at the different systems and understanding where one type of wood construction can actually enhance or support another, as opposed to replacing or having higher value than a different system. Maybe I can just take it from here a little bit. So Dave kind of set up a pretty fantastic argument, did a great job of framing this idea of architects working beyond the scale of buildings and potentially even that influences outside of a building could begin to shape the architectures that we create, the kind of physical objects that we create. So the two projects that we want to kind of unpack to talk to you about the role potentially of mass timber in affordable housing is one is this project called One House, Many Nations, which we've been working on for about 3 years now with the Opaskwayak Cree Nation and with a land defense movement in Canada called Idle No More. And the second project is a fairly new project that's being developed at the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Design Center, with partners at the Hennepin County Medical Center. So the first project we want to talk about is the kind of housing project for reserves in Canada. This is kind of the broad context for that. We're looking at about a 37% of housing on reserves that need major repairs. 34% of housing needs minor repairs. Overall, there's a 85,000 unit shortage of houses on reserves. 1 in 3 people live in substandard housing conditions on reserves, and 1 in 15 Indigenous people in Canada in urban areas experience homelessness. This is a mission that's being driven by, like I said, the One House, Many Nations campaign and Idle No More, and we were lucky enough to be asked to be a partner in this project and to kind of help lend this kind of extended systems thinking lens to their goal of providing affordable Indigenous housing in Canada. So one of the really interesting things about working with Idle No More and working specifically with the Opaskwayak Cree Nation is that there are a whole set of goals that extend beyond the building that are critical for the building's success. It can't just be low cost. It also has to be looking at improving a number of Indigenous practices that have been, on the downturn as a result of the last kind of 300 years of colonization, and working with them to enhance language, to provide spaces for intergenerational learning, to think critically about economic development and local resource usage on the reserves, so that we're trying to find ways of utilizing local materials and local ways of building so that we can generate economies as opposed to shipping in materials from the outside. And then, of course, there's also a set of design criteria. We set an initial goal of providing a house at under $50,000 per unit, looking at trying to find ways of identifying and instilling in that traditional knowledge of some kind into the structures, resilient building practices, configuring secondary spaces around the buildings to be able to enhance other kinds of program uses that aren't necessarily attached to housing, but that might be really critical to community living. And for this project, last year we received some funding from the University of Minnesota, along with donations from the Idle No More One House Many Nations campaign to develop a housing prototype for the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. And after about 3 months, it's a pretty quick timeline, we did a couple of trips up to OCN. We did a community design session, got a bunch of drawings, took those out, kind of tried to synthesize those, put those drawings back in their hands, and did another review session. And eventually we came up with this idea of a kind of modular mass timber, lightweight framed like hybrid structure. The mass timber systems are the kind of big rectangular boxes. They don't have any systems inside of them. The triangular pieces are stick framed, and they house all of the mechanical systems for the building. So there's kind of a smart and a less smart component logic to it. The triangular geometries are a really critical component for the design by the people from OCN. They were looking at something that was not just a box. They were looking to kind of react against the housing types that had been placed on them. And that triangular geometry also allowed that housing type to maneuver on the landscape in a slightly more nimble way. The solid wood, even though it initially is more costly than the lightweight wood construction, is really important because of its solid assembly. It reduces the likelihood of mold growth in houses in Canada. So a lot of the houses on reserves are poorly constructed, and that construction leads to a lot of healthcare issues. So we're hoping to use mass timber as a more resilient form of building and a safer form of building. And we installed and built this house in Toronto for this design and technology expo last fall, and it was used as a kind of programming tool to raise awareness about Indigenous housing issues across Canada and across the world. So we installed the entire structure in Toronto, did that programming around it for about 2 weeks, and then disassembled it and brought it back to OCN. This is what the structure actually looks like. The tall piece is the CLT box with a kind of raised roof on top of it. The triangular pieces are an entry, a bathroom, and a kitchen. And then we disassembled that structure and we sent it back to OCN to be put together. And this is actually when all of the interesting things started to happen on the project. Up until this moment, we were primarily kind of geared at developing and designing a kind of culturally sensitive and intelligent housing solution. And then when we got back to OCN, we were given the opportunity to participate in a social service training program with the community. And at which point in time, we began working directly with members from from the community to educate them in design thinking, to learn from them and how they would approach the design and building of a house, to think kind of critically about the development of small-scale, mass timber building assemblies, building jig sets with them so that they could begin to think about scaling up this, one-off housing solution into, a kind of manufacturing system, and then beginning to think about how those panels could kind of piece together. But the really critical component of this is that in the making of this house and the training of these workers and in their construction, there was a real sense of community built within that training group. A lot of social services were provided to those members, and a real sense of community was actually developed by that network of people. So as opposed to just looking for ways to develop a product outside and shipping it in and finding ways of making that cost efficient, one of the things that we're really interested in is working with industry and other architects and thinking critically about how mass timber might engage in the making directly with communities, and if that making could be actually used to refine or educate or provide services that have kept people or put people in positions where they are either homeless, have no jobs, and have a very sort of down outlook on life. So we're trying to really find ways of combining all these pieces together. The second project didn't come directly out of it, but it's actually going in a very similar direction. This is the Hennepin County Medical Center Remote Patient Rooms project. It's in the Twin Cities. It's in Minneapolis. One of the main drivers of this project is just the kind of cost of public health care in the Twin Cities. Last year, $150 million was spent on public health care costs. One of the main drivers of healthcare issues for homeless populations is the lack of a house in general. So we began to make the association between housing and reduced healthcare costs. And we're trying to leverage this project as a way of actually subsidizing affordable housing for homeless populations in the Twin Cities through Medicaid, as a way of actually driving down healthcare costs in the Twin Cities. Of course, this project is it's very early on, but again, we see the use of mass timber as a really strategic system because it's very durable. We're having to reconcile a lot of kind of detailed systems questions. How many services should people have? Where should those services be so that the medical workers who would be helping to facilitate this program can provide the medical services that they need to their clients? We're also trying to look at places in the Twin Cities that would be able to house these different spaces. So we're looking at the reuse of parking lots, parking garages, church parking lots, spaces that would otherwise not have a use that might be able to support small-scale modular housing units and kind of give us an opportunity to actually implement some of these strategies without having to put them into residential neighborhoods where you would end up with a lot of concern just with the introduction of small houses or the introduction of homeless populations into residential areas, which is obviously of huge concern. So here are some of the strategies that we're kind of moving through. Obviously, we're trying to get away from the condition on the right. We would love to find a way of developing an affordable high-rise solution like the projects that we're talking about before that are very cost-efficient. But somewhere in between those solutions are these smaller-scaled modular strategies that we're looking to deploy. And again, we're looking within this system very critically at the deployment and the manufacturing of them and trying to find ways of actually engaging in homeless populations to build these structures, to be able to provide stable housing for people while they're building it. If we do 3 shifts within this factory in a day, then we're required to provide housing while we do that. So it becomes an opportunity for us to provide housing to people while they're building their own homes. And then also to understand how their houses are made so that when they begin to take them over, there's an understanding of how to maintain them and all those other conditions. The biggest challenge that we're coming up right now is with the code. Obviously, they're too small to meet existing residential code. We're talking about, doing clusters of units which, make us we violate the accessible dwelling unit code. We would love to do them on RVs, but you can't put RVs in the Twin Cities. And the temporary housing kind of allowance isn't fitting out with us right now either. So one of the kind of key critical components right now is just trying to find a way to slip the system in within existing code restrictions. So so those two projects, I think, really get at how we're trying to approach affordable housing. We want to learn very much from all the conversations that were taking place before this about bringing costs of mass timber housing down, but we also want to look critically at partnerships with industry and helping industry maybe bridge, and make connections with, the medical community, for example, or with social service providers to begin adding additional subsidies that would allow us to build with mass timber in ways that are affordable through that subsidy allowance that would otherwise not be affordable if you didn't have those subsidies. So we just kind of want to end with the question of, are we asking the right questions? And I want to kind of go through a couple of quotes. These are just systems thinking quotes. So in designing a system, the primary criterion the designer uses in changing the structure or behavior of part of the system is not the effect on the efficiency of the part, but the effect on the effectiveness of the whole system. So it's really getting at, if the goal for us is to kind of take on homelessness, then we have to look beyond the individual house to do that. Affordable housing units are one part of a much larger strategy and solution, so we have to look at the entire system. And to do the wrong thing right is to do it efficiently but not effectively. Effectiveness is evaluated efficiency, therefore effectiveness is obtained only when the right thing is done right. So, are we as architects, designers, and manufacturers, engineers, asking all the right questions? Could we be asking other questions at other scales that might have, an enhanced impact? And could we ask questions maybe that would actually, improve the conditions of people so that they could afford, more costly houses? That would also be a way of kind of addressing the affordable housing issue. So that's where I'd like to leave it.